Okay, I'm here all by myself, and probably I'm here all by myself because it's President's Day. Oh, here comes Sean, okay. Hiya, Sean.
Hey, what's up, man?
I'm dressed like my favorite president.
Style.
Okay, yeah.
Style.
My favorite president is John Quincy Adams. He was theoretically the smartest president of all the presidents we've ever had. He could speak 5 different languages.
Oh, John Adams.
Yeah, John Adams' son, John Quincy Adams.
Oh.
John Quincy. Smart guy. So what we're talking about is noun bias. We started talking about this before. About 18 months, children will enter a world of accelerated word learning when their vocabularies begin to increase dramatically. It's an amazing time. By the time they're 2 and 3 years old, they will have huge vocabularies. They just pick up words. And of course, if you use the wrong words around them, they'll pick those up too. So you have to be careful. Great deal of research has indicated that this increase in the vocabulary is not distributed equally across all different forms of words. Especially in the United States, we pick up nouns are the words that we are more likely to pick up as Americans because we speak English. And English is as I talked about last time, English is a bastard language. Nouns are very important. It's a pidgin language pretty much. It's put together like a pidgin language, so nouns are very important. 2/3 of our sentences are nouns. Only 1/3 of our sentences are verbs. There's a great deal of evidence that North American children tend to learn more nouns much quicker than verbs, and that's because ball, camera, table, chair, all of these things are the main emphasis in our when we're talking to each other. The nouns are more important than the verbs are. As a matter of fact, a lot of times we'll just leave the verbs completely out. I was talking to Deb Robinson the other day, and she was saying that most people don't finish their sentences. Most people don't speak in sentences. And what she was talking about was that we will mention the subject, and half the time we don't follow through with the verb. But people understand what we're talking about, or we'll just have the object and the subject with no verb. And that's the way English is put together. Not all languages are this way. Chinese children were found to use more verbs than nouns because that's the way their language is put together. There's no noun bias among Korean toddlers. And of course, this is a Korean, as you can tell from his facial structure, and so is she. The structure of English is such that nouns tend to come in rather salient locations, such as at the end of sentences. East Asian languages, such as Japanese and Korean, tend to place verbs in salient positions at the end of the sentences. As Sean was saying last time, Navajo, the Dene language, of course, your verbs come at the end of your sentences. So they're very important. It's not like you can skip the verb. Unlike in English, the Chinese, Japanese, and Korean languages allow for nouns and pronouns to be dropped when the context is clear. So potentially you can just say the verb go and everything else is understood. Westerners tend to perceive the world in a more analytic fashion, seeing objects as discrete and separate, whereas East Asians are more likely to perceive the world in holistic terms, stressing the relations between objects. It is plausible that the cultural differences in noun bias reflect this difference in thinking about the world. So as Westerners, and because we are Westerners, we tend to be more analytic, and when we are more analytic, we separate things. That's the way we analyze things. But if we were Eastern and we spoke Chinese or Japanese or Korean, potentially we would see things as more holistic. So everything would relate to everything else. We are people that see the trees and not the forest. They are people that don't see the trees, but they do see the forest. And that's what they talk about. Japanese toddlers have been shown to make fewer demands on their parents than American counterparts and are less likely to assert their disobedience. Those occasions when Japanese toddlers do act unruly tend not to be viewed as signs of blossoming individuality, but rather as indicators of their immaturity. So they see misbehavior as being immature. As Americans, of course, we see the child seeking their autonomy. So we view things completely differently. The Japanese want everybody to do what they're supposed to do, and as Americans, we don't mind when our children misbehave, because that means they are trying to find their individuality. But of course, in a country like China or Japan, which is very collectivistic, you want the children to get along. Them misbehaving is more of a sign of immaturity than it is of individuality or autonomy. The developmental goal embraced by Japanese parents is much less a desire to see their children learn how to individuate and assert themselves than it is for them to learn how to accommodate to others and to become part of a harmonious social group, because it's so damn crowded in Japan that you have to get along. If you're standing in a group, of course, you want to be able to get along with the people in the group, otherwise somebody gets hurt. In the United States, of course, we seek to be away from other individuals. If we were to sit down in a subway train in the United States, we would sit as far away from everybody as we possibly could. If we were in Japan, they sit as close to each other as they possibly can, because that's the way that the country's put together. I told you, well, I haven't really told you about the Japanese stewardesses. Have you heard the story of my Japanese stewardess story?
No, I don't think so. I don't think you've ever.
Okay. Once upon a time in a land far, far away, Oklahoma, I was in Oklahoma and my wife was in Korea. I hadn't seen her in 6 months. This is when I was in my early 40s. So I had 2 weeks off and I decided to fly to Korea to be with my wife. I hadn't seen her in 6 months. So I got on a plane and flew from Oklahoma City, Will Rogers Airport, of course, in Oklahoma City, to Los Angeles. And in Los Angeles, I got on a JAL flight, Japanese Airlines flight, that flew to Tokyo. And then from Tokyo, I was going to fly a KAL flight to Seoul to visit my wife. So in Los Angeles, I got on the plane, and it was a jumbo jet. And for some reason, I was upstairs. I couldn't find my seat in the beginning because it was upstairs. Have you ever been in a jumbo jet?
No, not a jumbo jet.
Okay, you've got a layer down here, and then you go up the stairs, and there's a second layer of people. Yeah. It's kind of interesting, kind of like a double-decker bus. Anyway, I was upstairs. So what happened? So throughout the flight, it's an 18-hour flight. So throughout the flight, the Japanese stewardesses are just bustling back and forth. They gave everybody hot towels before the meal. They gave them a hot towel after the meal. And so they're just running back and forth. These ladies are sprinting up and down for 18 hours. So when we got off the flight, since I was flying to Korea, I didn't have to go through customs, not in Japan. I was just going to stay there for the night at the hotel out at the airport, and then I was going to get on a flight for Korea. So I didn't have to go through customs. And the other people that didn't have to go through customs were the Japanese stewardesses. And the reason they didn't have to go through customs is because they had made the flight to Los Angeles, and then they hadn't done anything in they weren't allowed to go away from the airport, and then they just flew right back to Japan. So they didn't have to go through customs either. So I was one of the first people to get on the Unirail that was about 2 miles from where we got off the plane to the airport. So it was on by Unirail, by train. So I got on the train, and I'm standing there, and who gets on next but all the stewardesses. Now in Japan, of course, you don't sit far away from each other. You start packing in as soon as you get on the train. So here I am, I was sitting there and kind of in the middle at the end, and all of a sudden I am surrounded by all these stewardesses. All the stewardesses from the JAL flight were right there, right next to me. And of course they don't have seats in Japan. That takes up too much room. So we're all standing there, and I've got Japanese stewardesses in front of me, behind me, to the left of me, and to the right of me. I've got Japanese stewardesses pressed up against me. And it's almost like, and of course in the beginning, when they first started coming on, I couldn't figure out why in the world why are they all coming around me? Why aren't they, sitting over, on the other end of the train? But that's just the way they do things in Japan. They pack in, and they pack in from one end to the other end. And that's what happened. I mean, by the time the train started, that car was packed. Well, see, so here I am, I'm standing there, and I don't know what you think you're supposed to do with your hands, but what do you do with your hands when you've got somebody, a young lady in front of you, you've got a young lady behind you, and you've got women to the left of you and to the right of you? So, I'm trying to not move because I didn't want to molest anybody. And then the train started. And so here I've got all these women who had been working their tails off for 18 hours on that flight. And they're just pressed right up, I mean literally, they're pressed right up against me. And I had women everywhere. There must have been 6 women touching me in some different places. And of course I'm trying to keep my hands from moving because I don't know, what do? You put your hands in your pocket? What do you do with yourself? So I've got, and like I've said before, it was like a standing lap dance. It was, as you can imagine, and it was a fairly bumpy ride from one place to the other. So everybody's kind of bouncing and jiggling up and down, and nobody's even thinking about anything is happening. And I was in my early 40s, so my goodness gracious, I should have responded to these young ladies in one way or another, but I didn't, and I got scared because I hadn't seen my wife in 6 months, and I was going over there to have a good time, as you can imagine, and here I didn't respond to these Japanese stewardesses at all. I mean, not at all. And they'd been sweating for 18 hours, but I got nothing from them. I mean, there was just no, it was almost like they weren't human or whatever. I wasn't responding to them.
Statues, huh? Statues?
So the question is, why wasn't I responding to them? And the answer had to do with pheromones. Japanese don't put off pheromones, because they've had arranged marriages for hundreds and hundreds of years. And because of that, they haven't needed to attract each other with their smells. But of course, as a European and as an American, who, of course, Europeans didn't have arranged marriages unless you're in the royal family, and I can assure you my family never was in anybody's royal family. So we put off pheromones to attract each other. That's just the way it works. And they didn't. And because of that, there was nothing to respond to. Normally we respond to sexual odors, which you either accept or you don't accept. Anyway, what happened so I'm scared to death, and I got on the KEL flight, and that's all that I was thinking about, because geez, I hadn't seen my wife in 6 months. So guess what she was thinking about when she saw me. And as soon as I saw her, everything was fine. It had to do with pheromones. And of course, at that point, I hadn't figured out what was going on. But once I got over to Korea, everything was great. And we had 2 months, 2 weeks of honeymoon, so everybody was happy. At least I was happy. I don't care if my wife was happy. Anyway, many cultures demonstrated tendencies for adolescents to act in the rebellious ways familiar to the West. However, this was by no means universal. Not everybody sees their adolescents as rebels. Rather, expectations for such antisocial behaviors were present in only 44% of societies with respect to boys and in only 18% of societies for girls. So, whereas it's more acceptable for males to be rebellious than it is for females to be accepted, it's still less than half of the populations that they looked at where rebellion was an acceptable practice. Here on the reservation, we see young teenage girls dyeing their hair, blue and red and pink, really fascinating colors. That's an act of rebellion, trying to individuate yourself from all the other people that you're around. It's an act of rebellion. And of course the males do interesting things like tattoo themselves, they get piercings. I don't know if the guys around here, I don't think so. I haven't seen any guys that had purple hair, but it's a thing that the young ladies do.
You actually used to. I remember that when I was a teen in high school.
Uh-huh.
And a little after 2000, there was guys and girls changing their hair. And
Changing their hair color?
Yeah, it got like pretty deep with that, to where it's like purple, lime green, fluorescent orange.
Piercings, tattoos?
Like that. Oh yeah, that's common nowadays. It's
Well,
like,
sure it is
it's
nowadays.
like a thing nowadays.
Right. Well, the only people that used to have tattoos were military people, and not all military people would do that. Marines did it, and the Navy did it because they would go to places where you could get tattoos. But Air Force and Army personnel didn't do it nearly as readily, but now, of course, literally everybody has tattoos in the military, as weird as that seems. The majority of cultures studied did not expect adolescents to behave especially disobediently. The notion that adolescence is universally associated with violence received little support. Rather, only 13% of societies expected adolescent boys to occasionally be violent, and only 3% of societies had such expectations for girls. Boys will be boys and girls will be girls. Girls are good and boys are bad. So when boys are bad, nobody looks askance at that, because boys are supposed to be that way. We even had a situation about a year ago where a young man raped a lady, and he was from a wealthy family. And when his case came up, the judge acquitted him because he didn't want to ruin his life, despite the fact, boys will be boys, and that's exactly what the judge said. Boys will be boys. This is just an anomaly, and this will never happen again, is what the judge said. Well, that's only acceptable in about 13% of societies around the world, that boys will be boys, and that boys are allowed to be to do negative things. The experiences of adolescence in Germany, Scotland, Japan, Bali, and Batak. Batak is an island group right off the coast of Australia. Were compared, and the results indicated that both individualism and modernity seem to increase the difficulties in adolescence. In particular, there appears to be more conflict between children and their parents in individualistic societies, where children seem to view parental control as a constraint that they must resist. But that's only in individualistic societies. You have to remember that most societies around the world are collectivistic, not individualistic. There seems to be increased adolescent distress, especially due to the sheer range of opportunities that confront children as societies industrialize and become more urbanized. One task in adolescence is to learn how to accept adult roles. This is much more straightforward when there are fewer role distinctions, and when youths are more in contact with adults as they are in more traditional agricultural societies. So we have more options. What are you going to be when you grow up? Well, I could be, wait a minute, let me think about this. I could be just about anything. But in an agricultural society, which is more traditional, you do things one way, and of course you become a farmer, because that's those are the choices that you have. The number of choices has continued to grow, which has lengthened the period of adolescence, sometimes referred to as failure to launch or emerging adulthood. One of the things that we need to think about is that once upon a time there were two genders, males and females. Of course, there were people doing other things other than male things and female things. But now we have lots of different identities that we can have. So you're not just male or female, you can be lesbian, you can be bisexual, you can be, of course this has to do with sexual orientation, but how do you identify yourself? Facebook accepts 52 different identities, besides, well, 50 other identities other than male and female. Now, a lot of it has to do with your sexual orientation, but some of it doesn't. The question came up last time, what is queer? Queer is where you don't identify either with male or female, as being male or female. It's a general term. It's not a specific term like bisexual or gay or lesbian. But there's lots and lots of different configurations. Now the interesting thing is what's going to happen in the future. With 52 ways of identifying yourself, either male, female, or one of these other things, how in the world, what is that going to do? Now we have not only choices as to what we're going to do for the rest of our lives, but we also have choices as to how we identify ourselves. We can identify ourselves as transgender. You can be transgender. There's just a ton of different things that you can be. So with all of these ideas, what's going to happen in the future? Not only can we be a lawyer or a doctor or a sales clerk or whatever, but we can also identify as a lot of different things. And what's that going to do what happens to us after we graduate from high school? What's going to happen next with all these different identities? Are we going to get married? Are we going to get married to somebody of the same gender that we are? Are we going to get married to somebody who identifies as, was born as one thing but identifies as something else? You know, are we going to maintain these loose relationships with other individuals? You know, this is just something that needs to be thought about, because whereas you think you know who you are and I think I know who I am, the reality is that somebody that we're talking to may have a different idea, and they may get offended if we try to force them into a select pigeonhole that we have created, that is an old pigeonhole that doesn't exist anymore. We can't go back. Everything has to keep going forward. We can't go back to the way things used to be. It just isn't that, that's not the way it works. I was thinking about this morning when I was thinking about the DSM-5. DSM-5 is about a decade outdated. It always is. And the reason is because it takes them so long to write the damn thing. But, so the mental illnesses that we're recognizing today in the DSM-5, a lot of them, some of them don't exist anymore, and some of them, we have new problems that are not being identified yet. And this is something that as psychologists we need to think about. Just because it's in the DSM-5 doesn't mean that we're going to be able to find it, or that that's all there is out there. There are new problems, and a lot of the new problems have to do with identity and how you feel about yourself. Has to do with it will have to do with your sexual orientation and the way that you think of yourself. And of course, none of that is in the DSM-5. The DSM-5 just came out in 2013, and it was in 2015 that Facebook decided that they were going to allow people to identify themselves differently. So now we've had 5 years of people referring to this, to being transgender, bisexual, or queer, or whatever. And of course, that's not even in the DSM-5. So, you're laughing, but the reality is that things have gone well beyond anything, and they're accelerating. Things are accelerating. If you see somebody that you identify as a female and you try to find out if she would like to go out on a date with you, you may discover that individual is not really female at all. She's somebody who dresses like a female and feels like a female sometimes on the inside. But she certainly doesn't want to go out with you because you don't understand her. You don't understand her/him.
But the thing about that is that what I'm thinking also too is when you mentioned about what other people could think other people are, but then the
Right.
people claims to be something.
Right.
That's the part that I guess I could see, because there are some people that claim to be like this and like that.
Right.
And everything like this, but I'm just like, I'm thinking that's different, you know? And I'm wondering why, why they're thinking that they're the way they are, but in reality, what they're showing and what people are getting of how they really are is a different perspective, a different name.
Oh, sure. It's how they identify themselves, but it's also how you see them.
Yeah.
So it's like talking to somebody. I say something to you, and I think I said one thing, and you hear something totally different. I mean, it's the same way with identifying people.
It's like the word queer you were talking about.
Right.
I have an uncle. He used that word a lot.
Okay.
As
a derogatory term.
yeah,
Right.
to us not to be soft in a way and stuff like that.
OJ.
And he was telling me, don't be scared, go do this and that, don't be queer, don't be
Yeah.
queer. He kept using that word
Right.
throughout the kids. And it just built inside of me. But later on, like, geez, when I got into high school, I realized, that term is actually meant for people who act
Gay.
gay or the opposite sex.
Right.
And I'm just like, okay, so basically, don't be a girl, basically what he's saying, or
Right.
don't be somebody who does that. So, and now it's like that term is actually being used freely to where it's like acceptable.
Right, yeah, it's an acceptable term.
Yeah.
You can identify yourself as queer.
But even that too.
But it doesn't mean what your uncle meant it to mean.
Yeah, but to me, it's like, I heard it from a different perspective.
Sure.
Thinking it was from a different perspective, but yeah, it turned out to be something else.
I mean, things change over time. That word has changed over time, and now it's an acceptable term again. It's like the term retarded. Psychology used the term retarded for 40, 50 years. But now you can't use the term anymore because it's pejorative, it's derogatory. We don't use the term anymore.
Yeah.
Because it's just not acceptable anymore.
Yeah.
So it's so things are changing, and you have to be aware of how they're changing. The transition to adulthood has been marked by 5 milestones: completing school, leaving home, becoming financially independent, getting married, having at least one child. Now, this was identified in 1960. In today's terms, that's not those aren't milestones of adulthood anymore. But in 1960, they were. In the United States in 1960, 77% of women and 65% of men had passed all 5 milestones by the age of 30. They completed school, they left home, they became financially independent, or they started working. Now this is by age 30. I did all of these things by age 19. I was financially independent. I had gotten married. I had one kid. I was in college, and I was no longer living at home. I did all this stuff at 19. Does that make me a hyper male? No, it just means that I was able to break away from my family a little bit earlier. In 2000, fewer than half of women and less than 1/3 of men had done so by this age. So this is 2000. Well, this is 20 years later. So that changes things. That changes a lot of different things. 20 years is a long, long time. So how many people have actually been able to do that? I was talking to somebody this weekend, and she's got a 38-year-old son that still lives with her. He still lives with her. He has completed school. He's dependent on her. He's never been married, and he doesn't have any children. So he's 38 years old, and he doesn't really fit with this criteria. East Asian children spent more days in school, 240 days per year in Japan versus 180 days per year in the United States. A greater percentage of class time was devoted to math education in the Asian school day than in the American school day. Asian teachers spend a greater percentage of time lecturing in the classroom compared with their American counterparts, 90% in Taiwan compared to 46% in the United States. Asian math lessons, approximately 80% of examples were real world in Japan compared with about 10% of examples in American classes. And this is one of the reasons why, as Americans, we're really bad at math. It's because the problems that they give us are not real world problems. They are just theoretical problems. And because of that, people just can't wrap their heads around what they're talking about. But in Asia, of course, 80% of all the examples are real world examples. So in Japan, almost every problem is a word problem. It's not just a number problem. Asian teachers assigned more homework to students. Fifth graders in the United States had less than half as much homework assigned to them as Taiwanese students. Asian parents seem to view education as more central to their children's lives than American parents do. As a matter of fact, a lot of times American parents will allow their children to drop out of school if they're not getting along with the teacher. Asian parents are more likely to provide their children with a desk. This is really important. They need to feel like they're supposed to do their homework. Well, where do you do your homework? If they have a specific place where they do their homework, like a desk, then they're more likely to think of themselves as a scholar, as a person that's supposed to do their homework. One study revealed that 98% of Taiwanese fifth graders had a desk in their home, compared with only 63% of American kids. 63%. So this is really important. If you have children, you need to get them a desk so that they feel like an academic. Stevenson in 1992 asked fifth graders to imagine that there was a wizard who would grant them anything that they wished for. About 70% of the wishes listed by Chinese students had to do with education. They wished for success in school or to be able to go to college. In contrast, only about 10% of American children wish for things relevant to education. About 10% of American children wish for less school. So we don't have the same idea about education in the United States that they have in Asia. But one of the things that we need to remember when we're dealing with the United States or we're dealing with Canada, one of the things we need to remember is that almost everybody in both Canada and the United States are immigrants. They came over here for one reason or another. And a lot of times education was not important in whatever country they came from, because most of them were peasants. They were not educated people. But once they came to the United States, in some cases, of course, education became extremely important to them, but not in all cases. A lot of times, these individuals needed to survive. And how did they survive? Well, they had to go to work. That meant that the kids had to go to work too. And for that reason, a lot of families have evolved as working families, not as school-going families. This is what happened to my family. My grandfather was able to quit school at the third grade. So he quit school in the third grade. So when it was time for my dad to graduate from junior high school, he wanted to go to high school. He was pretty smart and he was fairly successful and he liked school. He didn't want to go to work. He wanted to go to school. But my grandfather told him he couldn't, because how much education do you need anyway to get a job? And so he told my dad that the only way that he would allow him to go to high school was for him to pay room and board. So my dad worked in the evenings and he worked on the weekends at a grocery store so that he could go to high school, so that his father would let him go to high school. Now my grandfather was kind of an interesting guy, because he despite the fact he'd only been through the third grade, he understood things, and he invented two things, which I find just fascinating. One of the things he invented was banking turns. When he was working, we had just invented automobiles. We had trains, but we had just invented automobiles. And they didn't go very fast. If they went 40 miles an hour, that was really, really fast. So he decided that they could go faster if they banked the turns. This was a really serious problem with railroads. The railroads didn't bank their curves. And trains, if they went too fast, they would fly off the tracks because the tracks were flat. But once they started banking their turns, then they had a lot fewer railroad accidents. And my grandfather was the individual that built the first banked railroad track curve. He also worked on the Indianapolis 500. The Indianapolis 500 was important because it was the fastest track in the world. And the reason it was the fastest track in the world was because they banked their turns. And because of that, Barney Oldfield was able to drive really, really fast. He was able to drive at optimum speeds without slowing down going around the curves. Before, of course, you had to do that. Try it sometime. Try going around a flat curve and not skidding off into the ditch. It doesn't happen. And now we bank almost all of our curves, whether it's a road or whether it's a racetrack or whatever. We bank them because people are driving that rapidly, and most of them don't slow down. Now the reality is, if you're driving pulling into a banked curve, you can accelerate going into that curve, and you'll stay on. Centripetal force will allow you to stay in the curve without flying off. But it was my grandfather that invented that, because he was right there when things started going faster. And they had that really serious, you know how railroads are. They don't want to ever change anything. They don't want to spend any money for anything. Well, my grandfather didn't make any money off of that invention. And then he invented something else that he didn't make any money off of. He invented the backhoe. He worked with heavy equipment, and when hydraulics have been around for a really long time. But when they first started, this is in the 20s and 30s, when they first miniaturized these things, he was able to put them together and to create the backhoe. Now, if you look on the internet, it'll probably say that the guy that invented the backhoe was some guy from England in 1947. But the reality was that my grandfather invented it back in the 30s. And then the federal government confiscated it just before World War II. They confiscated his invention because they needed it for the war effort. And so they took it over to England. Nobody had patented it up to this point. And the reason he didn't patent it was because he was a Republican. And the President of the United States from 1932 until 1945 was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who he considered a communist. He hated him, and that's the reason he didn't patent his invention. Anyway, they took it from him. They confiscated it, and they took it over to England, and then somebody in England found one that they had left there when they went after D-Day. And he says in the internet that he's the one that invented it. But my grandfather had invented it 10 years before. But he was too stupid to patent the damn thing. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here. The East Asian children are doing much better as a group on math tests than the American children. Thus, one might expect East Asian. Why did I talk about that? Oh, I was talking about that because a lot of people that are Americans don't want to go to school. It's not part of who they are. It's not part of their family. So there's a lot of people that don't do that. I was born and raised in the Rust Belt in Indiana, where they made a lot of parts, automobiles and automobile parts. So when I went to school, I was educated to become a factory worker. And the reason is because everybody from that part, that was good money. That was really, really good money to go into the factory. And their families had been factory workers for decades, or for generations. They built the factories in that portion of Indiana in the 1880s, and the reason they did was because they had there was natural gas there. The whole place was a swamp, so it had created all this natural gas. So they were able to build factories and to run those factories off the natural gases. And for that reason, a lot of people in the area were factory workers, and they had been factory workers since the 1880s. A lot of the people that I went to high school with went right into the factory out of high school, and they made a lot more money than I did. They're probably still making more money than I am, but that's the reason I was talking about that. So Americans, of course, in a collectivist society, everybody does the same thing, but in an individualistic society, you become who you are, and your family tells you what to do next, and you become, and it just one thing follows the other. If my grandfather were alive today, he wouldn't have any respect for my job. He had a third grade education, he invented all of these things, and here I'm not inventing anything. So I must be an idiot. I'm not nearly as smart as he was. The East Asian children are doing much better as a group on math tests than the American children, thus one might expect East Asian mothers to be especially satisfied with their children's performance. But this ain't the way it works, okay? This does not seem to be the case. Rather, the American mothers report being far more satisfied with their children's performance than East Asian mothers. East Asian mothers are never satisfied. If you get a 100 on a test, you should have gotten 110.
Sounds like some Navajo women to me.
There you go, see? You guys are just as collectivistic. Compared with mothers of first grade children, Chinese and Japanese mothers of fifth grade children reported that a higher standard of achievement was necessary for them to be satisfied with their children's math performance. In stark contrast, the standards of American mothers were lower for fifth grade children than their first grade children. So whereas our expectations decline with time, theirs increases with time. It's because that's the way they see education. It appears to be far easier to meet standards for American mothers than East Asian mothers. If you come home with a C, that's okay, as far as your mom is concerned. At least you passed. Okay.
That sounds like a lot of Navajo men.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
They have really low expectations for Navajo men. That's really kind of curious.
It's actually, you know what, there's one thing that I've noticed about Navajo parents is that dads are just laid back and they're just like go along with whatever the kids want and the mother plans for them. They're just laid back. But the mom is the one that's really after the kids' ass.
She's the one that's
all
driving.
the time. Yeah, she's the one that's just like pushing everybody, making things happen.
You know that's the definition of matrilineal. It's one of the definitions of matrilineal, is the fact that everything's run by mom, not by dad. Dad's kind of just there. He's the sperm donor, and that's about all the activity he's going to get. This would suggest that American children have less reason to work hard at their studies than East Asian children. Numbers are harder to learn in English than in Japanese, Korean, or Japanese or Chinese because there are more irregular number words in English. So if we look at English, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 12, how is that a 1 and a 2? A 12. 11, that's just a word. Why is that a 1 and a 1 put together? 13, now that makes sense. Thir means 3, and teen means the tens.
You know, that's exactly what I've always thought.
Yeah, these are stupid words. We've just, and the problem is that English is a bastard language. English was put together from a lot of different languages, and because of that, some of our words are one thing, and some of our words are something totally different. I'm sure the names for the words for numbers in Navajo is a lot more logical than it is in English. I don't know what they are, but I'm sure it makes a lot more sense. And in Chinese, or in Japanese, or in Korean, the words for their numbers make sense. 1, it's 11 is 110. 12 is 210, or 10-2. 13 is 310. 14 is 410. That's a lot more logical than 14, 13, 15, 16, 17, 18, 12, 12? 12? What does that mean? 12 in German is Zwölf. Zwölf. That means 12. Okay, well, now we know where 12 came from.
Zwolf?
Zwölf.
Sound like a dog sound or something.
A barking dog, that's a German language for you. East Asian counting systems incorporate the base 10 concept, which is necessary for learning how to do multi-digit arithmetic in a more straightforward way than English does. So their base 10 is much more logical than our base 10. Thus, English speakers need more conceptual support for the base 10 concept than do speakers of East Asian languages, so it's a lot easier for them to learn their numbers, as fair as that is. And that's the end of chapter 5. We're going to start with chapter 6. This is the 6th week, just in case you were curious what week it was. It's the 6th week and I'm on chapter 6, so I'm caught up in this class. I'm so proud of myself. It's like a first for me. We're going to talk about personality. The first picture is a little risque. Can I say that? Okay. Not really. She's just showing some cleavage. She's got a bathing suit on.
Awesome.
Yeah, there we go. 20 statements test is one of the most widely used cross-cultural psychological measures, the 20 statements test. And the 20 statements test is 20 lines and you say something about yourself on every line. I am Navajo, I am tall, I am pretty, I am well-dressed, I am dressed like my favorite president today. There we go. John Quincy Adams. I swear, I thought everybody dressed like their favorite president on President's Day.
Oh yeah, today's President's Day.
Oh, is
See,
that
it's
the-
President's
Yeah.
Day.
I was like, what's going on with that today?
It must be Halloween again.
I was thinking like
I was just like, he's going
Some
through
kind
like
of
a
horse
phase
race
or
or
something.
What happened over the weekend? What
like,
happened over the weekend was, I had to put Standing Courage's class together. His 290 class. I'll tell you what, trying to cram 15 weeks of material into 10 weeks of 10 weeks is not the easiest thing in the world.
tell me that I was given the syllabus for my 340 class and I didn't like it.
We've got, see what we have to do, there's a certain amount of information that you guys need to accumulate in both 340 and 290. Well, he didn't, what he did was, I'm not sure what he did, but you need that information, otherwise you're not going to be able to go forward in either 340 or 290. In 290, you've got to tangle with Christine with 413. So if I don't teach you guys everything that you need to know in 290, then she's going to kick your butt when you get to 413. So I've got to get all that information in. I don't have a choice. I have no idea what Stanley what was on his mind. Anyway, okay, so that's the 20 questions test. It's really 20 statements test. It's really fascinating. And so they had people all around the world do the 20 statements test. Americans most often mentioned personal traits, attitudes, and abilities, which accounted for 48% of their self-description. I'm tall, I'm Navajo, these are all self-descriptions. These are all personal traits. The American pattern is similar to many other Western cultures. We got the same thing in Australia, in Britain, in Sweden, and in Canada. When other cultural groups were given the same measure, the results were very much different. The Maasai and the Samburu of Kenya had only 2% of their self-descriptions reflect personal characteristics. So they talked about how tall they were, how beautiful they were, what the color of their skin they were. They only talked about that 2% of the time. The rest of the time, they described themselves by their social memberships and their roles in those social memberships. I'm a member of you guys called yourselves Navajo, but they would say I'm a herder. I herd all the cows, that kind of thing. I'm a warrior. So it's not identifying themselves; it identifies their position in their society. But as Americans, we identify ourselves by what we look like, or we don't identify ourselves by our connections, because we're Americans. Americans think of themselves as tall and pretty. And I have lovely hair. I didn't say that. I did say that, but I didn't mean I have lovely hair. I barely have any hair at all. The Maasai and the Samburu pattern of a greater emphasis on roles and memberships appears in cultures from much of the rest of the world, and these cultural differences are already evident among kindergarten children. So this is what we're learning from our parents. Our parents are teaching us to either see ourselves as individuals, to see ourselves as tall and handsome and whatever. Our parents are teaching us this, but in other places around the world, including Puerto Rico, these individuals did not see themselves in that way. They saw themselves as by their social roles and their social standing. Cook Islanders, Malaysians, Chinese, Native Americans, other Africans, Puerto Ricans, Indians, and Japanese. These individuals are individuals from the Cook Islands, and as you can see, they're a dance group of little girls from the Cook Islands. A Danish study by Ma et al. What do we know about the name Ma? Have you ever seen the last name Ma? Ma? It all depends on how you say it. If you say Ma, it means mother in Chinese. If you say Ma, it means donkey in Chinese. So be careful how you say the name Ma. Ma et al. In 2012 looked at functional MRIs when participants were evaluating personal characteristics. The Danish participants showed no difference in their functional MRIs when they considered their social roles or their personal characteristics. Both involve the medial prefrontal cortex, which is typically activated in self-judgments. And this is the medial prefrontal cortex right here in the middle. When the researchers performed the same functional MRIs on Chinese participants, their medial prefrontal cortex was only activated when they were considering personal characteristics. When the Chinese thought of their social roles, their temporoparietal function, a junction, was activated. This is a region that more typically is involved in understanding other people's beliefs. So they were more interested in how other people saw them, the Chinese. But as the Danish, the people from Denmark that they did the study on, saw their social role from their own perspective, not from other people's perspective. So the Chinese, oops, I'm going the wrong direction. Ma et al. In 2012 suggests that Chinese participants were more likely thinking about other people's beliefs when they thought about their social roles. Though we are all individuals, humans are also a highly social species. Social interaction is a continuous balancing act between focusing on our differences and seeking our connection with others. Marcus and Kitayama first identified the independent view of the self in 1991. Independent individuals experience their identities as largely distinct from their relationships. Independent individuals are self-defining. Their attitudes, their personality traits, their preferences, their opinions, their abilities, their individual qualities. Oops. The self's experiences are rather stable and does not change much from situation to situation. The independent view of self is experienced as self-contained and exists as a relatively coherent and inviolate entity. Relationships vary and are fluid as individuals tend to be closer to close relations than distant ones. And of course, this has a lot to do with how you guys see your clans and your cousin brothers and your cousin sisters and whatnot. You've got a lot more connections than I do, for example. I don't even know my cousins, let alone call them my brothers and sisters. Individuals with independent identities still feel much closer to in-group than out-group members. However, they do not view them in fundamentally distinct ways. The main bifurcation is between self and non-self, and both in-group and out-group members are non-selves. So when you think about your family, you're thinking of somebody in your group. But if you're thinking of your cousin, you're thinking of somebody who was raised in another house, in another family. And they're still an out-group, despite the fact they're close to you. Marcus and Kitayama in 1991 also identified the interdependent self. The self overlaps quite a bit with an individual's significant relationships. Interdependent individuals are closely connected with others and are not experienced as distinct, unique entities. Interdependent entities are grounded in their relationships with others. Relationships come in a variety of forms. They require people to take on particular roles, such as father, student, friend, lover, daughter, that govern how they feel and behave toward their relationship partners. The identity of the interdependent individual is experienced as somewhat fluid in different situations. Depending on the situation and the role the person occupies in that situation, the person's experience of their self will vary accordingly. And a good example of this would be a father whose daughter is getting married. So what is his role at the wedding? What does he do in a traditional Western wedding? I don't know what you guys do. What is your father's role in a traditional Navajo wedding? What does he do? What's his role?
Which side, the male or female?
It's the female's father. What does he do?
No. I don't know.
What about the male's side? What does he do?
Never had a Navajo wedding.
Okay, how about a traditional Western wedding? What is a...
I think they use tobacco.
Okay,
Really, yeah, just basically just use tobacco.
That's the only time, I guess I heard, like, that's the only time the bride's mom is able to see the groom,
Yeah,
is when it's like, kind of like a peace pipe, I guess. And it's like a tobacco, and they share it with the family, right,
Yeah,
with the parents, and then the bride and groom.
so
That's
then-
all I heard.
Wait a minute.
That's
both families, they utilize tobacco just to
To establish it, yeah.
establish that strait between the both of them. prayer goes in with that, tobacco as well
Okay.
too.
But-
Otherwise, there's no other roles like,
So he can't see his mother-in-law?
no, that's one of the, they say that the mother-in-law is not supposed to see their son-in-law, like, at the home
Or be around.
be
yeah.
around them.
Wait a minute, but he has to live in,
He has to live near.
around her.
Or
Near them.
Near,
Not
not
the
like.
same home.
Mm-mm.
There's that saying, but then, you know,
Right.
they're not to conversate or they're not to.
They're not supposed to talk to
Yeah,
each
they
other.
don't talk to each other and stuff like that.
Right.
Be around each other, or talk. Or
Wow, that's
It's
gotta be
not
tough.
like get too close to each other and stuff like that.
That's why,
Living in the same area but not being able to interact
Yeah,
with that person?
that's why the women are the ones that plan it, everything.
Ah,
Yeah.
that's the point. That was my point, okay.
Yeah.
So what happens in a Western wedding is exactly the same thing. The father has almost nothing to do with anything, except he gives his daughter away. What does the father of the groom do in a Western wedding?
They ride in on horses?
No, I'm
Oh,
talking
no.
about in a Western wedding,
Oh,
Like a church wedding.
yeah.
Oh, they just hand them to the groom.
They don't either, they don't do it. Well, yeah, the father of the of the bride
Yeah.
hands off his daughter, and
My
that's
first wedding was like that.
that's his job.
Even though, like, well, I know a lot of people don't grow up around their dad. Like for me, my dad was only involved in my life up till I was like 12 years old.
Right, but then he came around to give you away?
And it was my request because that was like the Christian way.
Ah,
And it was best to be seen like that.
Right.
Especially in a church where both of your parents are there, especially if you're marrying the preacher's son.
Right.
So,
Ooh. Something wrong with preachers' kids. You've noticed that though, didn't you?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
and with that, then my second marriage, I just had my mom. My
Give you
mom.
away.
No, it wasn't giving away. It was like a justice of the peace, but both our moms were there. My husband's dad was never around since he was like a baby, so he didn't care to have his dad around.
Wow.
And then with mine, I didn't care to have my dad around because he was an alcoholic, and it was just.
But that's the reality. The father doesn't have hardly any job to do at a wedding. Neither father has hardly anything to do
But-
except he gives his daughter away.
But then
He
we
doesn't even plan anything. All he does is pay for it.
But then we have a daughter now, and my husband, he wants to be a better father than what his
what he
father.
experienced.
So right now he's like, well, what if, like, he's thinking ahead now, like, what if my daughter gets married? Like, who is she gonna marry?
She's what, 3?
Yeah, and he's like, we should have arranged marriage. We should,
Not this week.
we should find someone for her now.
We'll see you, Sean.
Like, right now, he's kind of like searching for someone for her that's not in the same clan group as us. So he's like, yeah, it's kind of like,
Arranged marriage.
that's, yeah.
Oh my goodness.
He's really
gracious.
all for it. For me, I'm just like, if she wants to, like, if she becomes of age and she wants that, then yeah, let's do it. But if
She
doesn't
lives in the
want-
Western society. Well, it's possible, I guess,
Yeah.
that she accepts more traditional ideas, but.
Mhm.
uh,
But it's interesting though, it's a lot, we have a different lifestyle than when we were growing up with our daughter.
Right, and I guess that's good,
Mhm.
yeah. I remember what you wrote this weekend.
Yeah. I replied to it too, saying, yeah.
Right. Relationships with one's in-group members are self-defining for those with interdependent selves. Thus, the people in the in-group assume considerable importance. People do not easily become in-group members, nor do close relationships easily dissipate into out-group relations. And of course, if you have friends, they stay your friends for an extended length of time. If they become an out-group, it's not that easy for them. As you can see, we have 3 Batmen and 1 Spider-Man. In 2007, Zhu, Zhang, Fan, and Han conducted an interesting functional MRI experiment on Western and Chinese participants. They asked the participants whether select trait adjectives characterize themselves or their mothers. So they're asking about their themselves and their mothers. Westerners showed different regions of the brain activation, suggesting that they represent themselves and their mothers in distinct ways. So you see yourself as not as your mother is a distinct individual from you. Okay. When the Chinese were evaluating themselves or their mothers, they showed activation patterns in the same regions for the two tasks, the medial prefrontal cortex, an area linked with self-representation. They're going to explain this. In other words, they saw themselves as part of their mothers. They saw them and their mothers as the same. They thought of them from the same regions. Okay.
Both Westerners and the Chinese?
The Chinese saw themselves as similar to their mothers. When they thought of themselves and they thought of their mothers, both the same area of their brains lit up. But as Westerners, when they thought of themselves and their mothers, different areas of their brain lit up. In other words, they identified their mother as a select, separate entity from themselves. I know. But the Chinese didn't. The Chinese, when they thought of their mother, they thought in the same region of their brain as themselves. So they identified their mother the same way they identified themselves.
That would be interesting to do that here.
Well, yeah, to see how collectivistic you guys are. Since you've been colonized and forced to not be tribal members anymore. You're more individualistic. Independent cells have a number of close relationships with members of their in-group. However, these relationships are less self-defining than are the corresponding relationships of those with more interdependent cells. Interdependent cells identify more strongly with their in-group, while independent cells have a more permeable relationship. In other words, if I were an interdependent person and I had a group around me, actually, we kind of had that in the faculty. Marius and Greg Redhouse and Jeremiah and who else? Me and Patrick Blackwater. We always sit together. We always joke with each other. We are a group. We're an in-group, and of course nobody tries to invade our in-group because we're like a gang of 5. Which is funny because the other Friday we had a meeting and all 5 of us were there, or there were 5 of us 5 were there, and we all sat in the same area and joked back and forth and did all those things. Our boss, Dr. Lerma, was right there, but he didn't try to become part of our group. He stayed separate from our group because, I don't know.
You should do an experiment, bring in a new person and see what happens.
We are. Theoretically, we're going to hire another psychology instructor. We'll see what happens.
Is it a male again?
No, it's going to be a female, I think. Yeah, the two candidates right now are female. And hopefully we'll hire both of them. That would be nice. I mean, right now I'm getting killed and Jeremiah's getting massacred from all the workload that we have.
Oh my gosh.
But we are independent people, so we don't feel the same connection with our in-group that interdependent people do. Because in-group relations are so critical for self-definition for people in more interdependent cultures, and because they serve and direct appropriate behaviors, it is especially necessary to identify those with whom one has such significant relationships. So a friendship group in an interdependent country like India or England, these people are a lot more important to you than in the United States. I had friends when I was in high school, but then when I went away to college, I didn't have anything more to do with those people, despite the fact we were friends. It was the fact that I was independent and I was going someplace else. Then the same thing happened in college. And it gets really kind of funny in college, because some colleges have fraternities, and my college had a lot of fraternities. And a lot of those individuals are really, really close friends. Even to this day, they became an interdependent group. And that's what they tried to teach them when they were going through their pledge class. Their pledge class were the people that they that they joined the fraternity with. And that was their pledge class. And to this day, those people still interact with each other. They found each other jobs. I was an independent. I lived in the dormitory. We didn't have groups like that. And of course, when I graduated from college, I joined the military. Once again, I've changed societal structures completely, from high school to college to the military. Obligations to others are an important part of in-group relations among interdependent people, so it is of vital importance for them to distinguish those toward whom they have obligations from those they do not. Becoming a member of an interdependent individual's in-group is thus a rather substantial accomplishment, and such relationships should be entered cautiously. As somebody from the United States, and we are independent-minded people, when I have friends, I don't feel like I can only have a select number of friends. I can have all the friends that I want. I have friends on the first floor, the second floor, the third floor, the fifth floor. And that's okay. I mean, I can do that. And I'm close to my friends, but I'm not dependent on my friends. In interdependent countries, you only have a select number of friends because you can't afford to have too many friends. In those countries, if somebody needs something, you have to give it to them. If you're my friend and you need $100, I have to give you $100. So I can't afford to have too many friends. But as an independent-minded person, because I'm from an independent country, I can have all the friends that I want. And if you ask for money, I'll probably not give it to you. Okay. But that's because it's a different mindset. A more independent person is likely to perceive themselves as existing and functioning separately from the social environment. So I can be friendly to the guys in the fob. I can be friendly to the guys on the first floor, the second floor, the third floor, and the fifth floor. But if I were in an independent country, I couldn't be friendly. If I'm friendly with the guys in the fob, I can't be friendly with the people on the first floor because, see, we are an in-group now, and we have to separate ourselves from everybody else. The environment is more tangential to the independent person's identity. Relationships can be formed and broken without having a large impact on the independent person's identity.
We see that a lot in schools, right? Like,
Right.
I can't be your friend because I'm friends with this person.
Exactly. Exactly. People with independent selves are more willing to form new relationships, maintain larger networks of relationships, and be less distressed should any of these relationships fade away over time. And of course, that's what's happened with me. I had friends in high school, I had friends in college, I had friends in the military, but once I left a select environment, I could separate myself from that environment. But if I were here on the reservation and I went to Pinyon High School, and then I came here, I came to Dene College, I could only be friends with people from Pinyon. I couldn't be friends with people from Chinle, no matter who they were or how nice they were. Wouldn't make any difference. I could only be friends with people from Pinyon because that's where I'm from. For independent persons, in-groups and out-groups are less consequential to self-construction. There is convergent evidence of heightened distinction between in-groups and out-groups among those who are more interdependent. Collectivistic cultures like the Japanese richly describe this pronounced difference in behavior between contexts involving in-groups, the uchi, and those involving outgroups, the Soto. So, well, these are, obviously, they all dress alike, so they have their own uchi. This is their group. And when they go someplace, they have to all sit together, they have to be with each other, they give each other support, and it's on a continual basis. Somebody who isn't like them, they are the Soto, they are the outgroup, they dress differently, they act differently, they can't have anything to do with those people. Studies have found that Asian Americans were more accurate than European Americans in identifying the emotions experienced by their close friends. Remember, this is our uchi. We are buddies, we're pals. We're pals to the extent that I know what you're feeling. And I'm going to be very, very accurate at identifying your feelings. So when you're sad, I know you're sad. And the reason I know you're sad is because I'm feeling an empathetic connection between you and I. The European Americans were more accurate than Asian Americans in identifying the emotions that were experienced by strangers. And the reality is, of course, as European Americans, I don't have an uchi. That doesn't exist for me. So if I don't know you and I see you with a sad look on your face, I'm going to be able to identify your emotion. But if I were Japanese, if I were Chinese, and I saw you with a sad look on your face, you're not part of my group, I wouldn't care what your emotions were. I would ignore you. The only people that I care about are the people that are in my uchi. Okay. And maybe that's the way Navajos feel about other tribes. I don't know. I was talking to somebody today, and he said, I used to go to Gallup, and I thought everybody was Navajo.
Yeah, that's what I thought too.
Yeah.
Until I worked at Thunderbird Supply Company. At the where they buy silver, raw material, turquoise, and coral. When I worked there, I started seeing different people, and I started asking like, "Are you Navajo?" And they'd be like, "No, I'm Zuni or Pima or people from all over." And then I started listening to. I thought they were Navajo, but when they're talking their language, it was different than Navajo. I'm like, that's not Navajo, that's Zuni.
Right.
Because they speak more with their nasal. And it's more, I don't know how to explain it, it's more like clicky sound. It's interesting.
I just had the same conversation with somebody else. I mean, it's so weird, because he was talking about his girlfriend is Sue.
Mm-hmm.
She's Lakota, I'm sorry. Did I say Sue? I meant Lakota. And she was going to Salish Kootenai College up on the Flathead in Pablo. And he was saying that he was up there and he was talking to somebody, and they were his girlfriend was trying to learn Kootenai, but Kootenai is a real guttural language. Comes from, sounds like they're trying to clear their throat of mucus, is what he said. He said something else, but we won't go into that. Anyway, yeah, so it's exactly the same thing. They heard their language as not even phonemes, not even words, but as sounds more than anything else, as weird as that is. This is fascinating. In places like Japan, where commitment to in-group members is strong, there should be less of a willingness to cooperate with outgoing members. People with interdependent selves focus their trust on people they share some kind of relationship. Yamagishi and Yamagishi found that Americans tend to have higher levels of general trust than the Japanese do, which is logical, because the only people you trust are your in-group, and your in-group is much smaller. As Americans, of course, I can be friends with everybody because I'm an independent person. I'm not going to be real close to anybody, but I'm going to be friends with everybody, and I trust you. I trust that you're not going to steal my keys and drive my car into a ditch or something. I trust you, but they don't. They're not going to trust any other people, because in their society, because it's so crowded, You can only trust the people that are in your uchi.
Mhm.
Okay.
So with that, could you relate that to hoarders?
I never thought about that, but that may be true.
Because I noticed that people who hoarder, within my family,
Mhm.
they have a uchi, like, they can only trust certain people to come into their house or
Right.
to go shopping with.
Right, and probably they only trust certain people to come into their house because they are not critical of their hoarding. Yeah, okay. And of course, they can only go shopping with this individual because they know that they're not going to be judgmental when they buy another one of these things that they have 15 of.
So the type of terminology I would use is interdependent in-group.
Yeah.
In-group.
Right,
Okay.
yeah, interdependent. Bond and Smith in 1996 found that people with more interdependent views of self are more likely to conform than those with more independent views. This may be because people with more interdependent selves view in-group members as an extension of themselves while maintaining distance from out-group people. This is a picture of an individual, of a Westerner, when they first invaded Japan. I know, it's fairly,
It looks scary.
yeah, it is very complimentary.